Welcome to the third lecture in English 193, Communication in the Sciences. This lecture directly informs your upcoming group project in the course, where you're going to need to collaborate with peers on a comparison report between how a specific body of research is communicated through a journal article versus a video recorded interview. This lecture looks at the differences and similarities between the IMRaD Essay formula and the science presentation. Before we begin, I just want to say that what I'm about to present are not the be-all, end-all definitions of these genres within science communication, nor am I giving you every nuance about them, and the context in which they occur will always affect them in terms of the specifics. So these are very general guidelines. The IMRaD manuscript is most commonly seen in the form of a journal article, or sometimes in the form of a publicly published report, as in a white paper or a government publication. It has 5 parts, beginning with the introduction, material and methods section, the results, sometimes, but not always, analysis, and then a discussion that also serves as a conclusion section. Let's go over them in detail here. The introduction is the background information section, and like the abstract that we went over previously in the last module of the course, introduces both the research problem and the central question. We also know from the John Swales article, 1987, that it's important to consider whether the announcement of principal findings occurs within this introduction section, or to withhold it until the results section. There is no right or wrong here. It just matters in terms of rhetoric. So we found Swales found, I should say, that when the APFs are given up front, then it's often easier for the reader to follow along throughout the rest of the essay. However, it doesn't pack as much of a rhetorical punch, let's say, because we already know what the big reveal is. Moving on to materials and methods. This section is probably the driest, but it's very important. It describes the actual specimens that have been studied, if that's applicable, to the format of the research, and also lists the tools and the technology that were used. The methodology, which is the system or the rationale for how the study was conducted, should also be described in detail. In the middle, we have possibly the most important section, which are the results of the study. Here you should list all of your significant findings. This is where you can go into immense detail about those APFs, but be mindful that this section of the essay can also be the most complex for your reader to follow. So there needs to be, as we've learned from the Green textbook, lots of use of active voice and storytelling and characterization to make the results the most legible that they can be. Aiding in this section often are the use of graphs and diagrams, and these provide visual ways for people to simultaneously take in the findings. Moving on to the uncommon but not unheard of analysis section, which forms the little a in our IMRaD acronym. The analysis section is an extension of the results section and goes into even greater detail and does the work of interpretation. This is most common in theoretical studies found in physics or mathematics, but also in social sciences and the humanities, where the results, rather than just being given, are then interpreted through a theoretical framework, and that framework is discussed once again in the discussion section. So it's a way of kind of extending the results section and linking it up to possibly a body of theory or philosophy if the research applies to that. And then finally, there is always a discussion section, and the discussion also serves to fulfill an interpretive function, but more so in the way of how the results in the research connect to other studies or other literature in the field. So this is often a place to kind of come back to the introduction in terms of the general questions, and then try to link that to contemporaries in your field who are doing research that is either similar or research that maybe served as as the scaffolding for your own. The conclusion should also be a very short summary and reiteration of that introduction section, but also a fairly concrete statement about where the research is headed next and why it's being pursued, either in the manner that it is or if that reason has already been given and proven through the study. All right, let's go a little deeper with this. So in terms of actually writing an IMRaD essay then, those 5 sections, they're a great guide and a good armature to build upon, but we can get even more specific and think about all the little elements and modes in which the writing occurs. So I like to reference this 8-step model, not only because I think it creates a nice, even more detailed outline for how you're going to compose your essay, but also because each of them serves as a prompt to you as the writer to remind yourself about what you should be doing and asking yourself in that moment within the writing process. The introduction section encompasses the first 3 steps of this model, which I alluded to in the previous slide. So we frame the question, that is the cause and sort of the launch pad for the research. We introduce the research in terms of the field, the discipline, and then also any contemporary critical issues that are facing that field of research and that also inform the question. And then we state our hypothesis, what we assume or seek to gain knowledge about through conducting the study. The next 3 sections of the IMRaD formula have their own prompts, which are fairly straightforward. So the material and methods should directly feed into describing the experiment or the study that was conducted. The results then are stated and analyzed, and then, as I said in the previous section, an extended explicit analysis section is then used for interpretation. And then our discussion section at the end comprised of both a compare the results and the findings to other findings and literature in the field, and then lastly to contemplate and to think more deeply and speculate about what those results imply. We can also think about this in a recursive way, which means that it points back to itself. And if we think about it as kind of a Russian doll model, the innermost components of this 8-step writing model link up to each other and then proceed in sort of a diametric movement. So if we think about the analysis needs to point back to the experiment or the study. It is directly analyzing what happened over the course of those events. But then when we move down and come a little bit closer to our conclusion section, if we choose to include a section on interpretation, it needs to go back and directly interpret our hypothesis. So our hypothesis is assumed to have either posed a question of its own or to have made a broad statement that needs to be supported. So how does our interpretation of the results either answer that question or support that broad claim? Then, as we move a little bit closer towards the end in our comparison and our linking up to other applicable research in the field, we come back to our own research. So we need to contextualize ourselves and our own body of research within that discipline and that sort of milieu of scientific colleagues. And then lastly, as we contemplate those results and what they might imply or how they might be used practically in the world, then we should also come back to addressing our primary question, the one that launched the paper, the one that sought to capture the attention of the reader from the very beginning, of course, needs to be either answered or further worked through in that final little section. So what's different when we think about a science presentation? Well, the answer is not much, but also some very important things that have more to do with the environment and the context in which the presentation is happening. It may seem obvious, or maybe not, but when a reader is progressing through a journal article that you've written, they are in full control of where they read it, how long they read it, And often they're doing it because they're seeking that information actively. In a presentation context, there's a lot more distractions. There are numerous reasons why a person might have attended. They may not be there even to see your presentation, but just happen to be in the audience at that moment. And you're in control of the pacing in terms of moving through the various levels of information. So it can be a bit harder because you have to actively read the room, so to speak, while the presentation is going on. Some of this is accomplished in this first section, which differs from the IMRaD formula, and it's called the preamble. This can include a biography, your own, and maybe a short bit about the credentials of everyone who's on your team who might be presenting. Any disclosures that you have to make. So if there were any disclaimers about the study itself, any conflicts of interest that needed to be reported, or this could also be just a good space to more closely align your research topic with the context and the premise for the event, whether that's a conference or a public talk, let's say, that could be part of a fundraising event or part of a some sort of educational workshop. From here, it starts to look much more familiar like the IMRaD model. We have an introduction, we have methods, and we have results. Now, you're not going to spend as much time on these, especially the introduction. You want this to be like a nice runway kind of takeoff where you're speeding, you're hurtling through the air ever faster towards the big reveal, which in this case, in the presentation, is a dedicated analysis section. This is important because, again, people are not reading the text, and so they're in less control in terms of how they make the connections and do that cognitive work to actually glean the important points and implications from the results. So in a presentation context, there is much more onus on the presenter in terms of science communication to make that analysis clear, but also to make it rhetorically effective. And then lastly, rather than a discussion section, because often there's a Q&A period that follows, or perhaps you're participating as part of a moderated panel, there will be a dedicated period for discussing your presentation. So instead, you end with an acknowledgement section, and this is something that's not very exciting, but it's part of being a professional, and it's very important. Typically, you would acknowledge your professor or your supervisor if you're in a PhD context, and you want to acknowledge any participants if they were named or identities were revealed and they agreed to be part of the publication and dissemination of that research. You also want to acknowledge any funding, especially any grants that were given in order to conduct the study. And lastly, you may want to thank the venue for hosting you. There are, of course, other factors that we have to consider in the context of a science presentation in terms of how information is mediated and how it's received. The biggest one is probably the visual rhetoric factor. So, although there are graphs and illustrations often in the results section of journal articles, in a science presentation, the visuals are much more prominent. Typically, you'll find anywhere from let's say 15 to 30 slides in the average science presentation. So there's a lot of visual information to contend with as well. And the style in which that information is presented, including the typography, the quality of the imagery, the actual rendering style of any illustrations or animations, can impact how that information is perceived and received by the audience. And typically, the better the visual rhetoric quality, the more convincing overall and effective the presentation is. Another thing that's really important to consider is the voice and vocal intonation. So by intonation, we mean putting stress on a particular syllable or on a whole word within a sentence in order to import more meaning upon it. And sometimes we can do this very purposely, but often we do this unintentionally when we speak. And so it's important to rehearse your presentation and to think about which words you want to rest on and how the lowering and the raising of your voice might also affect how the information is received. Typically, pauses serve to create suspense, but if you're a person who pauses quite often without that being intended, that can also miscommunicate to the audience about the level of significance of what you're saying. Gesticulation, hand movements are another big one. All of the hand talkers out there, I'm speaking directly to you. Research has actually shown that some gesticulation can be very effective because we then associate that action with a certain concept and it makes the information easier to memorize. However, as you can imagine, wild levels of gesticulation are distracting. So again, this is a situation where you want to rehearse how you're going to present the information in a very like a practice-based way. So you want to be standing, you want to be possibly even looking in the mirror to know how either effective in terms of, or how minimal or how maximal you can be with your gesticulations in order to, yes, kind of create visual points or visual points of emphasis, I should say, on certain areas of the research, but also not to be doing it constantly and to not be doing it to a distracting level. Another kind of unfortunate pattern that we have as humans is that we like to repeat ourselves, and often in a science presentation, because we're sometimes reading, sometimes ad-libbing, there's a tendency to go back and repeat information, even entire phrases that have already been mentioned in the presentation. This feels necessary to us as the presenter because, unlike with the published journal article, the reader can't conveniently go back, flip the pages or scroll to find that thing that you said that they want to read again. In this context where everything is live, and like I said, sometimes you're ad-libbing, sometimes not, there's a tendency when you go off script to then be repetitive. So one of the ways to minimize this is to just be very careful about your word choices from the beginning. Using a more consistent vocabulary and being very conscientious about that has been shown to decrease the need to repeat concepts because they're already, they're embodied within those repeated terms, and that makes it easier for the audience to follow you through your sequence of thoughts. The last one is also a very important one because you're always short on time in these presentations. It's often you're communicating possibly many months to even many years worth of research in a 10 to 15 minute time slot. And so you're always racing against the clock. But you also want to be very careful with your pacing and not go too quickly. This is the number one reason that people either stop paying attention or they come away with only about 50% of the information that you wanted them to. So this is another great reason to rehearse your presentation ahead of time and to get to a point where you're comfortable in the pacing, but you feel like you're moving along at a steady clip, because we also, when I say we, I'm talking about us researchers, us in academia. We always have a tendency to get excited and talk in more detail than is necessary, especially when it's our own little area of research. So yes, another aspect of rehearsal is always that timing element, and finding a pace that works comfortably for you will also be a more effective way to communicate to your audience, because they won't feel either the anxiety of moving too fast or possibly the kind of dullness of moving too slowly. So the last piece that I wanted to go over is more anecdotal in nature, but I think it can be helpful for young researchers. And this is specifically how audience and format can impact the way that our information is delivered and then possibly also received. So in terms of audience, tone is really relative to how familiar you are with the space as well as the crowd. So I think it's pretty obvious that if we know more people in the audience, we'll be more at ease. But I also want you to consider how the physical environment may affect your delivery. If you're presenting somewhere on the university campus and you know the building and the layout, that's going to put you more at ease. Your tone will probably be more casual. Your register might also be affected. But the important thing here is that striking a good balance with tone and having a warm and inviting tone has been shown to be more rhetorically effective, especially when presenting new and complex data. Pacing is something that can often be determined unconsciously by our assumptions about our audience, and one of those factors is the perception of the audience's literacy on the topic. It's good to have a read on your audience, but we don't want to overread them and assume too much. So if we assume that the audience is illiterate on our topic, then we may slow down our pacing too much. It may become dull, or it may become sort of overly didactic and kind of quote unquote baby talk to the audience, and we want to avoid that. But also, you don't want to assume that your audience is overly familiar with your information either, because speeding up and glazing over things won't do them a service either. So the point here is to really try and base the literacy on the details of the event that you're presenting at. Obviously, if you're presenting in to a bunch of specialists in your field, then you don't need to slow down or spend as much time on any one particular slide, let's say. But it's best to just be conscious of a potential bias there and to not let that become a determining factor in your pacing. Another fairly obvious one, but always good to keep in mind, is that the formality of the event determines the register. This can be, ranging from maybe you're presenting at an international conference in a convention center to something as informal as an educational workshop with 10 to 20 people. Just like green from your textbook, striking a good balance between conventional and informal register will be the most effective in any of these situations, but we can't always control this. Sometimes it's an unconscious behavior, and just to take note of when you might float up into that abstract register and in what social context it happens. Okay, a few notes in terms of format. Smaller venues produce safer atmospheres, so there's a big difference in terms of how much you're willing to share and how, quote unquote human you are in front of the audience depending on the size of the venue. If you go to, and this is not uncommon, if you go to a large conference, there will probably be several breakout sessions. This can feel sort of disappointing at first because there might only be 10 or 15 people in one of your breakout sessions while 4 or 5 other panels are happening at the same time. However, you can usually become much more casual and have better exchanges, even nonverbal exchanges with your audience. And they might be even more receptive and interested in your research. So this is something to embrace, and presenting to smaller crowds can also be a great way, if they are in your field, to generate lasting relationships, so i.e. networking. Unfortunately, in those large conferences, there is a new trend of overloading panels, which I've seen a few times, where there might even be 4 or 5 presentations in the time span of an hour and a half, and this makes pacing difficult. This is not something that young researchers have a say in, so not something that they can really control, but just to plan ahead. Again, rehearsal will help with that, but also when you're organizing your information, making your introduction short, not overly short, but concise and efficient, and then moving those important findings up sooner than you might think that you need to, just so that you don't run out of time or even have your last couple of slides cut off because the panel is actually running short on time. Sometimes conferences are recorded, either audio or video, and this can add some stress. Good mentalization techniques will help you through this, but another thing is to actually, in your notes, add reminders to yourself to calm down, slow down, take a breath, smile. These things will help you to not become so inhibited by the idea of it being recorded. And actually, having any conference proceedings recorded is a great opportunity. So it's important that you become even more aware of how that might impact your performance, because at the same time, we also don't want to play to the camera either and be overly performative. So it's just, again, about becoming a little bit more self-reflexive in your presentation style. And then finally, because it's pandemic times, virtual presentations are the new, the mode of the day. And actually, I don't think they'll be going away anytime soon. So obviously, after COVID is contained, we'll be going back to in-person conferences, I'm sure, as soon as that's possible and safe. But this has only brought on the kind of renaissance of the virtual conference. And going forward, I can definitely see most conferences having a blended format of physical and virtual. However, there is a downside because in virtual presentations, we can often feel like we're not really talking to other live people, and we can fall flat in our rhetoric as well. So refining your presentation skills, being cognizant of where you're looking, that you're speaking in a lively manner, that you're not reading from the screen and just moving through slides as if nobody is on the other end. And perhaps most importantly, just the idea that you are adapting the way in which you're communicating to be more appropriate for a virtual format, i.e. when you don't have those gesticulations and you don't have the eye contact with people, what other ways can you do to emphasize your point and also bring some humanity to the nature of the medium that you're communicating through? All right, well, that about wraps it up. I hope that this has been helpful. As always, if you have any questions or want more information about anything I said, please get in touch through email, and I look forward to your group comparison reports.